Louisville, Kentucky. 1965. A cold case finally solved. Her name was Darlene Mae Whitaker, a 30-year-old nurse known for her unwavering kindness, working long nights at the local hospital and attending church every Sunday. But in the spring of '65, Darlene vanished on her way home. Her car was found idle along a quiet stretch of highway, the passenger door ajar, blood on the seat, no sign of Darlene. What followed was years of confusion, dead ends, and a community left haunted by the unknown. Tips dried up, leads vanished. The case turned cold, but decades later, one piece of evidence, long preserved, would spark a stunning revelation. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the spring of 1965, life in Louisville, Kentucky moved at a steady, familiar pace. Nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside downtown, lived 30-year-old Darlene Mae Whitaker, a woman whose life was as composed and dependable as the routine she kept. She was a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital, known by staff and patients alike for her gentle tone, calming smile, and the soft click of her heels during overnight shifts. Darlene didn't seek attention, but those who knew her rarely forgot her presence. She lived alone in a modest brick apartment off Bardstown Road. One bedroom, small kitchen, a flower box in the window. She didn't drive far. Her commute was short, her social circle tighter still. But within that space, Darlene built a life of quiet purpose. She often visited her younger sister, Ruth, who lived nearby with her husband and two small children. The two women shared more than blood. They shared secrets, memories, and weekly grocery runs. Darlene's sense of duty wasn't confined to hospital walls. She was deeply involved in her local Baptist church, where she taught Sunday school and helped organize monthly food drives for elderly members of the congregation. During the holiday season, she coordinated handmade care packages for hospital patients with no family. Her gestures were always modest, handwritten notes, small knitted scarves, but always heartfelt. Despite her warmth, Darlene was known to be private. Neighbors recalled that while she was quick to offer a helping hand, she rarely spoke at length about herself. She didn't date publicly. She didn't entertain often. But she was never lonely. Her life was full in the way that only the quietly content can understand. Louisville in the 1960s stood at a crossroads of tradition and change. The city bore the legacy of old Southern charm, but was increasingly touched by the civil rights movement and national unrest. Darlene's world, however, remained insulated from much of it. Her life revolved around family, faith, and her patients. In a rapidly shifting world, she was a figure of constancy. Those who knew her saw in her the best of their town, steady, humble, and deeply rooted in service. She wasn't the kind of person who made enemies. She wasn't the type to invite conflict. That's why when she didn't show up for her night shift on April 17th, the alarm bells rang loud and fast. The hospital staff were the first to notice. Darlene was never late, never absent without warning. Her supervisor made a few phone calls. Then her sister Ruth tried to reach her. When there was no answer, Ruth drove to Darlene's apartment. Her car was gone. The lights were off. There were no signs of forced entry, just an eerie stillness. By sunrise, Darlene was officially reported missing. The city that once found comfort in her predictability now buzzed with unease. How could a woman so responsible, so ingrained in her routine, just vanish? Had she been in an accident? Had someone followed her? Was this a random act or something far more personal? Why would a woman so responsible, so reliable, simply vanish without a trace? April 17, 1965 began like any other Saturday for Darlene Mae Whitaker. That afternoon, she stopped by her sister Ruth's home for tea and a quick check-in with the children. Ruth would later recall that Darlene seemed tired but in good spirits, already dressed in her pale blue nurse's uniform beneath a beige coat. She mentioned needing to stop for gas before heading to her night shift at Mercy General Hospital. She promised to call the next day. That call never came. At 11 p.m., when Darlene failed to clock in, her absence raised immediate concern. Her reputation at the hospital was impeccable, never tardy, never absent without cause. The charge nurse tried calling her apartment, no answer. A few colleagues assumed she might have come down with something. Others feared the worst. The answer came in the early morning hours, at 2:30 a.m. A Louisville police patrol officer noticed a vehicle idling awkwardly off River Road. near a quiet wooded bend not far from the Ohio River. It was a cream-colored 1959 Buick, its hazard lights still flashing in the drizzle. One door hung slightly ajar. The officer approached cautiously. Inside, he found a nurse's coat folded neatly on the passenger seat. Darlene's ID badge was still clipped to the lapel. Her handbag and packed lunch were missing. A faint smear of something dark stained the edge of the driver's seat. A flashlight beam revealed a deeper, more concentrated pool on the upholstery. Preliminary tests confirmed it was blood. There were no skid marks on the road. No shattered glass. No discarded belongings scattered nearby. No signs of a struggle. And no Darlene. The next morning, Ruth filed an official missing persons report. Within hours, the Louisville Police Department launched a city-wide search. Officers canvassed River Road and the surrounding woodlands. Canines were brought in. Divers checked riverbanks downstream. Flyers bearing Darlene's photo were tacked to utility poles and store windows across the city. The Courier-Journal ran her story within 48 hours, featuring a solemn headline, "Local Nurse Missing Under Suspicious Circumstances." Despite the outpouring of concern, leads were thin. Her co-workers had no idea where she might have gone. She hadn't reported any fears, hadn't mentioned a new relationship, and had no history of sudden disappearances. At the hospital, grief gave way to unease. Nurses began requesting paired shifts. Night staff asked for security escorts to their cars. In the neighborhood, women double-locked their doors. Parents walked their children to school in pairs. A lingering question crept into every conversation. If Darlene, kind, careful Darlene, could vanish so suddenly, who could be next? Theories spread fast. Some wondered if she'd suffered a breakdown and wandered away. Others feared she'd been abducted, possibly by a stranger, or more unsettling still, by someone she trusted. Police reviewed nearby gas station logs, checked vehicle sightings, and interviewed dozens of drivers who had passed through River Road that night. None had seen a struggle. None had seen Darlene. By day 5, the search widened, but progress slowed. The drizzle that night had likely washed away any trace evidence. Without eyewitnesses or a clear motive, detectives were left with more questions than answers. Was this a crime of opportunity? A random act of violence along a dark, quiet road? Or had someone been waiting for her? Had Darlene encountered a stranger that night, or was someone she knew responsible for her disappearance? 10 days after Darlene Whitaker vanished, the city of Louisville held its breath. Rumors swirled, theories multiplied, and the search continued. But no one could have prepared for what the Ohio River would eventually give back. On the morning of April 27, 1965, a fisherman named James Halbert cast his line from the banks just east of Portland Wharf Park. As he moved along the river's edge, he spotted something tangled in low-hanging branches near the water. At first he thought it was debris, a piece of tarp or discarded clothing. But as he stepped closer, his breath caught. A human hand broke the surface. Police arrived within minutes. The recovery team worked quietly, carefully, as a crowd of onlookers gathered near the bank. The figure in the water was still clad in a nurse's uniform. Her shoes had swollen from saturation, her legs stiff with river rot. An ID badge still clung to her collar. There was no question. It was Darlene. Her body had drifted nearly 5 miles downstream from where her car had been discovered. The coroner's office confirmed what the crime scene suggested. Darlene had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, most likely from a heavy, rounded object. She had not died instantly. Water in her lungs indicated she was still breathing, barely, when she entered the river. There were no signs of sexual assault. No defensive wounds, but investigators noted faint ligature marks on her wrists, suggesting she had been restrained at some point before death. The precision of the attack, the speed with which she vanished, all pointed to a calculated, deliberate act. The horror of it shook the community. Darlene, a caregiver by nature, had met a violent, lonely end. And the river, cold, unfeeling, and had cradled her secret for over a week. Police faced immense pressure. The media demanded updates. Her family, devastated by confirmation of her death, pleaded for answers. But in 1965, forensic science was limited. The body, exposed to water for days, had been stripped of many potential clues. The river had washed away trace evidence, fingerprints, fibers, DNA, long before it could be preserved. Detectives retraced her last known steps again. They questioned more hospital employees, reviewed security logs, and searched local properties along the riverbank. Nothing concrete surfaced. The murder weapon was never found. No suspicious vehicles were seen near River Road that night. No witness had come forward. And then there was the matter of motive. Darlene had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in any disputes. She kept to herself. Her lifestyle, orderly, restrained, quiet, didn't lend itself to dramatic altercations or jealous confrontations. Was this a crime of opportunity? Had someone seen her alone, targeted her, acted on impulse? Or was this something far more chilling, premeditated, calculated, personal? Investigators began to re-examine those closest to her, wondering if they'd missed something. A disgruntled patient? A coworker hiding resentment? A man she might have rejected quietly? As days turned to weeks and the river resumed its calm flow, one question began to echo through Louisville homes, across police departments, and within Darlene's grieving family. Could anyone in Darlene's quiet life have harbored the kind of rage necessary for this brutal crime? In the immediate aftermath of Darlene Whitaker's body being recovered from the Ohio River, detectives launched a full-scale investigation, combing through her final known interactions, retracing her last steps, and interviewing anyone who had seen or spoken with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. The first line of inquiry focused on those closest to her. Family members, including her sister Ruth, were quickly ruled out. Her co-workers at Mercy General were interviewed one by one. Most described Darlene as kind, soft-spoken, and reserved. None reported any conflicts. But one name raised eyebrows. Marvin Ellis, a maintenance worker recently let go for misconduct. He had a prior conviction for burglary and had once been reprimanded for inappropriate comments toward nursing staff. He became an early person of interest. Ellis was interrogated for hours. He admitted to noticing Darlene even having a crush, but denied any involvement in her disappearance. He claimed he'd been at a local pool hall with friends the night she vanished. His alibi checked out. Receipts and multiple witness statements cleared him. Then came a more disturbing lead. A former psychiatric patient, Walter Jameson, had become fixated on Darlene during a brief hospital stay. She had reported receiving anonymous letters, one of which contained thinly veiled threats. Jameson was tracked down in Michigan, where he had relocated in early April, 2 weeks before Darlene's death. His timeline was verified through employment records and bus fare receipts. Another dead end. As the weeks passed, tips continued to pour in, but most proved baseless. One caller claimed to have seen Darlene arguing with a man in a blue sedan. Another reported screams near the river. A psychic even offered guidance, describing a barn and a shadowy figure. None of it led anywhere. False confessions plagued the department. A drifter arrested for shoplifting claimed responsibility, only to later admit he'd made it up to get a hot meal. The pressure on the Louisville Police Department was mounting. The public demanded results. The media began speculating about whether Darlene's murder might be connected to other unsolved disappearances in the region. Some thought a serial predator could be responsible, but no consistent pattern emerged. Darlene's family refused to let the case fade. Her mother became a visible figure at vigils, often holding a framed photo of her daughter during community gatherings. Ruth, now the public voice of the Whitaker family, gave interviews pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Their sorrow was public and their fight personal. Behind the scenes, cracks in the investigation began to show. Internal tension between senior detectives led to disorganization. Evidence logs weren't consistently maintained. Key witness statements were misfiled. In one case, a piece of fabric recovered from Darlene's car went missing from the evidence room, only to reappear months later. Accountability was murky, a common flaw in departments of that era, where oversight was often informal and records easily misplaced. As months turned into years, the investigation lost momentum. The original detectives moved on to new cases or retired. The file was transferred between departments and boxed away, labeled simply Whitaker Darlene M. Homicide. The trail grew colder with each passing year, and those once invested, the nurses, neighbors, even some family members, began to lose hope. Louisville moved forward, but the wound never fully healed. And in the background loomed a haunting question. Was the case doomed from the beginning due to early investigative mistakes? By the mid-1970s, the Whitaker case was no longer a priority. Louisville had grown, and with growth came new crimes, new victims, and new headlines. Detectives who had once pored over every photograph and interview transcript had either retired or been reassigned. In a department stretched thin and underfunded, the murder of a nurse from 1965 became one more file in a sea of unresolved tragedies. Darlene's name faded from the newspapers. The river that had once carried her story now carried silence. In the basement of the Louisville Police Department, her case file was boxed, labeled, and filed away. Inside were handwritten notes, faded photographs, fingerprint cards, and fragments of evidence sealed in brittle plastic sleeves. The label on the side read Whitaker, Darlene M., Unsolved Homicide, 1965. But while the system forgot, her family didn't. Her sister, Ruth, refused to let the story die. Every few years, she would contact local journalists, hoping to spark renewed attention. She wrote letters to editors, called detectives, and attended public town meetings where she'd rise from her seat to ask, "What about the cold cases?" She wasn't a public figure, just a determined sister who couldn't let go of the idea that somewhere, someone still knew something. In 1982, nearly 2 decades after Darlene's death, Ruth hand-delivered a letter to the governor's office in Frankfurt. It was handwritten, neatly folded, and pleaded for the creation of a dedicated cold case unit in Kentucky. She never received a direct reply, but the gesture made local news. The Courier-Journal ran a small column titled, "Sister Still Seeks Justice After 17 Years." For the family, those brief moments of media coverage felt like oxygen, fleeting but vital. Then came the 1990s. Forensic science was transforming. DNA testing had entered mainstream use, turning decades-old mysteries into solvable puzzles, if the right evidence had been preserved. Across the country, families of cold case victims watched as long-dormant investigations sprang back to life. Some finally got answers. Others learned that time had eroded their only chance. Ruth wondered which category Darlene would fall into. Unbeknownst to her, someone, likely a meticulous evidence technician decades earlier, had sealed several items from the original investigation in a temperature-controlled evidence vault. Darlene's nurse's uniform, preserved hair strands, and upholstery fabric cut from her Buick's blood-stained seat. The items sat undisturbed, cataloged but forgotten. As years turned to decades, those boxes endured 3 departmental moves, 2 reorganizations, and countless personnel changes. Yet somehow they survived intact. A time capsule of 1965 police work waiting for science to catch up. By the early 2000s, Darlene's case was a memory known only to her aging relatives and a few retired detectives who still spoke of her name in interviews about Louisville's unsolved crimes. Ruth was now in her 60s, her voice softer but her resolve unbroken. "We never stopped praying for her," she said in a 2001 radio interview. "One day I believe God will make the truth known." Decades of silence had eroded hope, but not faith. In 2019, a young detective assigned to the Cold Case Division stumbled across the Whitaker file while reviewing archived homicides for re-examination. The thick folder, yellowed and brittle, bore a small red tag, "Evidence Retained." That tag changed everything. When he opened the boxes, the faint scent of age and dust filled the air. Inside were the artifacts of a forgotten life. A nurse's uniform folded neatly, a single brown hair sealed in an envelope, and faded Polaroids of the Buick parked on River Road. After 54 years of silence, the past was about to speak again. Could anything inside those aged evidence boxes still hold the answers after so much time? In early 2021, Louisville's Cold Case Division launched an ambitious new initiative in partnership with a nationally recognized forensics laboratory that specialized in analyzing degraded and trace DNA. The goal was simple but daunting: revisit long-forgotten cases where evidence had been preserved and see what modern science could uncover. Among the first files selected was that of Darlene Mae Whitaker, the beloved nurse murdered in 1965. Her case stood out for one reason: preservation. Unlike many investigations from that era, key evidence in Darlene's case had been stored under climate-controlled conditions. Investigators retrieved 2 particularly promising items: a segment of fabric removed from the front seat of her Buick stained with blood, and a single brown hair found tangled in the collar of her nurse's uniform. Though conventional DNA testing had failed in previous decades, the technology had evolved. Scientists now had access to techniques like mitochondrial DNA sequencing, which could extract partial genetic profiles even from old, degraded samples. These fragments couldn't be uploaded to CODIS, the National Criminal Database, but they could be used for genealogical tracing, the same method that had famously led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer. Over several months, the lab developed and expanded two partial profiles. One, pulled from the hair strand, showed maternal lineage consistent with a small regional pool in eastern Kentucky. The second, lifted from the blood-stained fabric, yielded a mitochondrial match that aligned with an even narrower set of familial markers. Analysts began reverse engineering a family tree, tracing the DNA backwards through generations using public ancestry databases, obituaries, birth records, and newspaper clippings. The process was methodical and slow, like piecing together a puzzle with missing corners. But eventually the trail led to a living relative, a distant cousin in Tennessee who, after an interview, revealed a familiar name: Thomas Eldridge. Eldridge's name hadn't surfaced during the original investigation. He had no direct connection to Darlene that police knew of, or so they thought. But background checks revealed something chilling. Eldridge had worked briefly at Mercy General Hospital in early 1965 as a custodial orderly. He would have had access to patient wings, staff lounges, and parking lots. He left the position after just a few months, citing personal reasons. Worse still, at the time of Darlene's disappearance, Eldridge had lived less than 3 blocks from River Road, within walking distance of where her Buick had been found abandoned. The more investigators dug, the darker his past became. Arrested in 1971 for assault, suspicion in a domestic battery case in 1979, multiple charges of disorderly conduct throughout the 1980s. Nothing ever resulted in a long prison term, but the pattern was troubling. In November 2022, Louisville detectives traveled to St. Augustine, Florida, where Eldridge, now 80 years old, was living in a modest retirement community. They knocked on his door, armed with a warrant for a voluntary DNA swab and a court-approved authorization to question him. The man who answered was frail, slow-moving, but mentally sharp. He denied knowing anyone named Darlene Whitaker, denied ever working at Mercy General, denied everything. But the records proved otherwise. His employment history matched. His home address in 1965 was within 300 yards of the crime scene, and when his DNA sample was compared to the mitochondrial profile recovered from Darlene's uniform, it was a familial match, consistent with a male relative, and statistically improbable to be coincidence. The science had spoken. Decades of silence had cracked open, but as investigators prepared to file charges, one question lingered in the interrogation room. Would Thomas Eldridge confess? Or would science alone be enough to finally bring justice? On the morning of March 8, 2023, as the sun warmed the quiet streets of St. Augustine, Florida, a pair of detectives from Louisville knocked on the pale blue door of a small one-story home in a retirement community. Inside lived 80-year-old Thomas Eldridge, the man they now believed had murdered Darlene Mae Whitaker nearly 6 decades earlier. Eldridge answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane. He appeared confused but compliant. The detectives explained the charge: first-degree murder tied to a 1965 cold case out of Louisville, Kentucky. The victim's name was Darlene Whitaker. He said he didn't know her. He asked to sit down. When officers read him his rights, he looked stunned, as if the past had finally caught up to him. His arrest was nonviolent, and he was booked into the St. Johns County Jail awaiting extradition. The news broke later that day. Louisville's leading paper ran the headline in bold: "Cold case solved after 58 years. Suspect in 1965, murder of local nurse arrested in Florida." The story spread rapidly, picked up by regional outlets and national true crime blogs. For many, it was a name they barely remembered. For others, Darlene's family, her old neighbors, former hospital staff, it was a ghost resurrected. Thomas Eldridge had lived a relatively quiet life since leaving Kentucky in the early 1970s. He'd worked sporadic jobs, mostly in logistics and trucking, racking up minor arrests but nothing that stuck. He had no spouse, no children. No one in Florida suspected the polite older man who walked his dog each morning had once been a person of interest in a violent riverfront killing. Back in Louisville, the revelation reopened old wounds. Longtime residents who remembered Darlene's disappearance were shocked. A few recalled Eldridge as a young man, quiet, perhaps a little awkward, but unremarkable. He kept to himself, one woman told reporters. We never thought twice about him. But the evidence had grown too strong to ignore. Hospital employment records confirmed. Eldridge had worked at Mercy General for a brief 3-month period in 1965. He had been on duty the same evening Darlene went missing. Payroll slips, now digitized, placed him in the building that night. Further documentation showed he lived in an apartment less than 3 blocks from River Road, a detail that, in isolation, might have meant nothing. But combined with the familial DNA link, the proximity to the scene and the timeline, investigators believed they had enough to press charges. In a taped interview with detectives, Eldridge maintained his innocence. He claimed to have no memory of working at the hospital, no knowledge of Darlene Whitaker, and no connection to the area where her body was found. When shown employment records, he dismissed them as clerical mistakes. When presented with the genealogical DNA results, he said nothing. Darlene's surviving family and her sister Ruth, now 79, and a handful of nieces and nephews, gathered privately when the arrest was announced. Ruth issued a brief statement. We never gave up hope. We never stopped believing that her story mattered. Louisville's mayor held a press conference, calling the development a long overdue step toward justice, and praised the cold case unit for their persistence. The community response was a mix of shock and sorrow, joy that an arrest had been made, and grief that it had taken so long. But as the case moved toward trial, one question still lingered, one that would ultimately rest on the shoulders of 12 strangers in a courtroom. After all these years, would a jury believe the science? On January 8, 2024, nearly 6 decades after Darlene Mae Whitaker's body was pulled from the Ohio River, the trial of Thomas Eldridge began in a Louisville courtroom packed with quiet tension. Reporters filled the press benches. Family members sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, many of them wearing small white ribbons in Darlene's memory. The prosecution called the case historic, not just because of its age, but because it reflected how far forensic science had come. The state's case centered around 3 key elements: the mitochondrial DNA link to Eldridge's family line, his confirmed employment at Mercy General Hospital at the time of the murder, and his residential proximity to the crime scene. Prosecutors methodically laid out the timeline. They brought in forensic genealogists who explained how partial DNA from degraded samples could be mapped into family trees. They showed how investigators tracked a distant cousin to Eldridge through public records, military draft cards, and even obituaries, building a case backward from the smallest fragments of identity. They also presented the jury with hospital employment records, placing Eldridge on site the very night Darlene vanished. The paper trail was thin but clear. Eldridge clocked in just after 6 p.m. on April 17, 1965. He was scheduled to work in the basement wing, custodial duty. He clocked out just before midnight, minutes after Darlene's car was discovered abandoned. Then came the human element, a key moment in the trial. A retired nurse, now in her 80s, was called to the stand. She had worked alongside Darlene in the 1960s. Though frail, her voice was steady as she described an unsettling memory. Eldridge, she said, would often linger in the nurse's break room during his shift. He rarely spoke, but he watched. He always looked at Darlene too long, she testified. There was a quiet intensity about it, I remember thinking. It wasn't right. The defense pushed back hard. They argued the DNA was partial and circumstantial. They pointed out the lack of a murder weapon, the absence of eyewitnesses, and raised questions about the chain of custody for the old evidence. How could they be sure, they asked, that the fabric sample and the hair hadn't been contaminated after all these years? But the prosecution had prepared for these arguments. Crime lab experts testified to the careful archival of the evidence and the strict protocols followed during recent analysis. They emphasized that while no single piece of evidence was conclusive on its own, together they told a cohesive story. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and carefully orchestrated visuals of Darlene's car, The old crime scene photos and the forensics timeline. The case went to the jury. They deliberated for just under 3 hours. When the foreperson stood and read the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom was silent. Then a soft cry broke from the gallery, followed by tears, quiet embraces, and the heavy release of a decades-old weight. Ruth Whitaker, now nearing 80, held her daughter's hand as the judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Eldridge sat motionless. He did not look at the gallery. He did not speak. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Ruth for a comment. She said simply, "We finally have peace." That night, members of the community, many of them too young to remember the original crime, gathered at the church Darlene once attended. Candles were lit. A small photo of Darlene, smiling in her nurse's uniform, stood at the altar. Louisville had changed. Generations had come and gone. But justice had finally arrived, quietly, solemnly, powerfully, beyond the verdict. What did this case teach us about justice, memory, and persistence? In 2024, 58 years after Darlene Mae Whitaker was murdered on her way to work at Mercy General Hospital, her story found resolution. But justice was not the end of her legacy. It was the beginning of a ripple effect that would touch lives far beyond those who knew her. Her church, the same modest Baptist congregation she had once taught Sunday school in, held a memorial service the weekend after the verdict. The sanctuary filled with longtime members and strangers alike. They read scripture, lit candles, and shared stories not only of Darlene's murder, but of her life. How she brought soup to a widowed neighbor, how she sat beside a dying patient long after her shift had ended. One former parishioner, now elderly, recalled how Darlene once stayed late to help her daughter complete her school fundraiser when no one else had shown up. At Mercy General Hospital, administrators dedicated a small stone bench outside the nurses' wing, the same wing Darlene had worked in all those years ago. Etched into the stone were the words, "In memory of Darlene Whitaker, gentle hands, fierce spirit." It became a quiet space for reflection, a symbol of how the people who care for others often leave behind the deepest imprints. For Ruth Whitaker, the years of advocacy had finally come full circle. In an emotional interview aired days after the trial, she said, "We never stopped speaking her name, and now the silence is broken." Her words resonated far beyond Louisville. Viewers across the country, many of them families of missing or murdered loved ones, reached out saying Darlene's case gave them hope, that persistence mattered, that someone someday might open their own forgotten file, and they were right. Following the successful prosecution of Thomas Eldridge, Kentucky's cold case unit received renewed attention. Local officials approved increased grant funding aimed at revisiting long-dormant cases with preserved evidence. The Whitaker case became a template, a proof of concept that science, combined with record-keeping and unyielding family advocacy, could rewrite history. Within months, additional files were reopened. Other families were contacted. Some saw developments. Others received long-sought updates. The state began training officers on cold case protocols and evidence preservation. It was the beginning of a cultural shift in how the justice system viewed historical crimes, not as lost causes, but as delayed truths waiting to be revealed. To the public, Darlene's name became more than a tragic headline from the 1960s. She became a symbol of grace, of persistence, and of the quiet lives whose stories demand to be told. Her murder, long unsolved, had become part of a much bigger story, one about the evolution of justice and the role of everyday people in preserving memory. Darlene had no children, no sprawling estate, no front-page notoriety during her life. But she had a purpose, in the patients she cared for, in the neighbors she helped, in the family she loved. And now in death, her legacy touched even more. Investigators, lawmakers, survivors, and those who simply needed proof that time doesn't erase the truth. Her story stood as a powerful reminder of three critical truths: the power of DNA, the importance of preserved evidence, and the unwavering commitment of family. Darlene was never forgotten. And now, with her name spoken again in courtrooms, churches, and across the airwaves, she never will be. She was more than a file, more than a case. She was a daughter, a sister, a caregiver, remembered now with dignity, and with justice finally served. Darlene Mae Whitaker's story is more than the tragic retelling of a 1965 murder. It is a testament to persistence, progress, and the quiet, enduring power of memory. For nearly 6 decades, her case sat dormant in a metal cabinet, shrouded by time and silence. Her life and her death became a symbol of the thousands of unsolved crimes across America that never saw justice. And yet, through the tireless determination of her family and the emergence of groundbreaking forensic science, Darlene's voice was finally heard. The arrest and conviction of Thomas Eldridge may have come late in life, but it delivered something profound: accountability. For Darlene's family, it meant closure after years of uncertainty. For the community of Louisville, it meant healing an old wound. And for investigators and families around the country, it sent a powerful message. No case is too cold, no truth too distant. Darlene was not just a victim. She was a caregiver, a sister, a neighbor, and a light in the lives of many. Today, her name stands for more than tragedy. It represents resilience, justice, and the impact one quiet life can have. In her memory, we are reminded that speaking their names matters, telling their stories matters, and believing in justice, no matter how long it takes, matters. If this case moved you, honor Darlene and others like her. Share their names. Support cold case investigations. Because justice delayed is not justice denied.